today. Thanks, Daniel, for joining us. So insuretech, probably not an industry most people want to come to a panel, at 10 a.m. in the morning in San Francisco, but I think today we have a really special treat. So Daniel here is the CEO and founder of Lemonade, which I think is one of the most ambitious plays in this space. You got your first license 2 years ago, in September 2016, raised $120 million from SoftBank just a couple months later. How do you do it? How did you get started in an industry where there's been hundreds of years of practice, it's very mature, as Mike pointed out, it's very sclerotic. How did you differentiate in this space?
Well, neither myself nor my co-founder come from insurance. We've been 20 years in the tech space, founding different companies. And when we encountered insurance, we encountered a sector that is vast. I mean, every household, trillions of dollars, no matter by what currency you measure, this is a huge industry, which is still dominated by the same companies that dominated 100 years ago. I mean, literally, the dominant companies today were founded in the era of the horse-drawn carriage. And you say, okay, well, if it's huge and unchanged, but it's loved, then that's fine. But of course, it's deeply unloved. The Urban Dictionary defines insurance as a promise to pay later that is never fulfilled. So for an entrepreneur looking at a sector that is that huge, that prevalent, that unchanged, and that disliked was too much to pass up on. So we really set out to create a different kind of insurance company. And being newcomers to the space allowed us to go back to first principles. Rather than study insurance, we did the opposite. We locked ourselves in a white room with a whiteboard, and we said, if we were going to build an insurance company from scratch, how would we want it to be? And the resultant company was different by just about every measure. The business model is different, the distribution model is different, obviously the tech stack is different. And by rethinking those first principles and having the benefit of no legacy, it allows you to do stuff that incumbents, frankly, just aren't able to do.
So let's walk through a little bit of that. So you're a certified B Corp. Let's talk a little bit about the business model and how that's differentiated.
So in trying to figure out why people dislike insurance so much, and there's at least 700 years of record of people cursing insurance companies, we worked with one of our founding team members, Professor Dan Ariely, the famous behavioral economist, who spent 10 years studying what it is that brings out the devil in us. Why do we sometimes behave well, sometimes behave poorly? And he concluded that if you set out to create a system with a design intent of bringing out the worst in humanity, it would look a lot like an insurance company. Just that everything that social sciences tell us you must not do are manifested in insurance companies. There's an asymmetry of information, there's a win-lose value proposition, and at its core, there's the perception, at least, and oftentimes the reality of a conflict of interest. You claim $1,000 of me. If I don't pay you those $1,000, I'm 1,000 richer, you're 1,000 poorer. And that is a sure recipe for a conflicted relationship. And we decided that if at the core of the business model there's a conflict of interest, you cannot build a trusting, trustworthy, lovable brand on top of that. It is going to manifest one way or another sooner or later. So in that room with that whiteboard, when we started rethinking about things, we decided that what we're going to try and build is an insurance company that takes a flat fee, never takes more, never takes less. And one of the ways to achieve that is to say, okay, well, what happens if I charged you and 1 million people like you so much money, but the claims weren't that much? What do I do with the leftover money? Well, I'm not going to throw it into the sea, and most insurance companies take it as an underwriting profit. What we decided to do is to give it to charity, and to ask you, the customer, to say, hey, which nonprofit do you care about? And then you achieve a few things. One is you neutralize our incentive to deny or delay your claim, because we're not going to keep that money either way. We have set a limit on how much money we can make, and making your life harder won't profit us. And part of that is rooted in the notion that our moral fiber is no better than the next guy. If you put us in a conflicted relationship, that conflict will manifest with us as it does with others. So that was part of the system. And the other part, or part of the thinking, the other part is, how do we bring out the best in you? 25% of Americans say it's okay to embellish claims. I like to think that the other 75% were brought up not to admit that kind of thing to strangers.
Exactly.
So people feel like they're entitled to embellish claims, which is interesting. Fraud in insurance is not hardened criminals from the Far East hacking into your system. It's people like you and me who feel like they may embellish
Soften
claims.
criminals.
Exactly. So for us, the B Corp and the charity is actually a core part of our business model.
Yes.
Because what it does is it changes the relationship. Insurance today is a bilateral relationship. It's me against you. As soon as we designate a nonprofit and we say, hey, this is going to be the beneficiary of any underwriting profits, any leftover money, two things happen. One is I have no incentive to give you a hard time. And in fact, we pay a third of our claims within 3 seconds, algorithmically, instantaneously. And our average time for paying a claim is a day. So this is radically faster than what insurance companies typically do. But also, you might bring your better angels rather than the devil to the table when you come to deal with us, because you know that if you embellish your claim, you're not hurting some nameless, faceless behemoth with whom you have a conflicted relationship. You're hurting that soup kitchen that you volunteer on Sundays and that you designated as your give-back cause. So for us, the whole nonprofit, the B Corp element, isn't just a cherry on top. It's really a core part of our business model, how to change a bilateral relationship into a trilateral relationship in order to affect a radically different dynamic.
Now let me ask you, so when you think about, you're in the renter insurance and broader sort of property insurance space, how do you think about competing with some of these incumbents who have been around a century, in some cases multiple centuries, who've collected data, have compiled practices? How do you do that from scratch and de novo with no data in the database and sort of a blank MySQL file?
So yes, 10% of the Fortune 500 companies are insurance companies, and the average age is 100 years. So you're absolutely right. These are companies that have established themselves and survive for centuries oftentimes. And they have no doubt a massive data advantage on us, and data plays a huge role in insurance. Predicting the future is entirely based on using data sets from the past. And in our first couple of years in market, we've been at a data disadvantage. So we started off with a wild ass guess. We're kind of graduating as data comes in to an educated guess, but we are still at a data disadvantage compared to incumbents. But we gather about 100 times more data for every customer that we gather because of the digital interaction. Everything with us is done through chatbots, and everything's done digitally through AI. And when you walk into your local State Farm agent on the high street, he or she will take maybe 20 data points from you. We'll take about 2 orders of magnitude more data points just because of the data sets that we're able to use. So it won't take us 100 years to bridge that gap. I guesstimate that we're probably 18 months, maybe 24 months away from parity. And thereafter, those systems become massively advantageous. So I think that while we're still playing a game of catch-up, we're seeing the finishing line ahead of us, and we're hopeful that being built on a digital substrate with data and AI built into the very fabric of our company will allow us to ultimately outperform not merely on user experience and instantaneous payment of claims, but in the hard work of predicting and pricing risk.
Now, let me ask you, and obviously you've had incredible growth. I think the statistic is that in the first quarter of this year in 2018, you had the same revenue that you had all of last year, and you had 1,000% growth in the first 6 months of this year. But it was reported in the last 2 weeks that you had a net underwriting loss of $1.5 million and a net combined ratio of 138%, which meant that for every dollar in premium you took in, you paid out about $1.40 out, so that the model wasn't profitable. How does that change in the next couple of years? How do you sort of get to profitability, particularly on the core sort of insurance part of the business for Lemonade?
I think that's exactly right, and it ties back to the question that we just discussed about data. So for us, the first few years, we kind of wrote them off as a learning experience. Until you have data, you can't have an expectation of pricing risk reliably. What you want to see is a progression, so that as the data accumulates, you become better and better at this. Our underwriting, or our loss ratio, as it's known in the industry, for the first half of 2018 was half of what it was in the first half of 2017. And we seeing that kind of progression gives us confidence. So it's a trend line that we're expecting. So yes, it's true that we cannot sustain the level of losses that we had in the first few months, but the trajectory is exactly as we would want it to be, in fact, ahead of where we expected it to be. So it isn't an underlying concern. But let me develop this further for a minute. I met with one of the heads of one of the largest insurance companies in the US, and we were having a chat, and he says to me, hey, Daniel, our loss ratio is 54%, which passes for small talk amongst insurance people. And the loss ratio is, for every dollar that I take in premiums, what percentage do I pay out in claims? 54% is a good number, and ours is higher than that, as you just said. And I said to him, the average American has one testicle. And
You don't hear that every day.
no, and that doesn't pass for small talk amongst insurance executives. And he said, and he looked at me somewhat bemused, as you might expect. And I said to him, averages are kind of meaningless. What happens is that insurance companies, because they onboard with these 20 data points, N equals millions. And what I mean by that is they look at millions of people as being more or less identical because they don't have the resolution to tell them apart. So they look at this massive group of people and they say, loss ratio, and they take 10 million people and they talk about them as if they were one monolith. When you build insurance on a digital substrate, you get to about 100 times more resolution. And just 2 years in market, we're already finding that those groups that traditional insurance companies regard as monolithic are actually made up of subgroups. And we're already identifying 3 or 4 subgroups with 300 to 400% difference in their behavior and their loss ratios. But you need that degree of microscopic resolution to determine that. And we think that ultimately this gets to perhaps not N equals 1, but a much higher degree of precision. And therefore, ultimately, as you play this movie forward, you find that the digital infrastructure of an insurance company changes the very core of underwriting and pricing risk in a way that hasn't manifested yet. The first act of Lemonade and companies like us is about delighting consumers, lowering cost of acquisition, paying claims in seconds. Act 2 is about using those delightful apps. They generate phenomenal data, which ultimately allows you to price risk at a far higher degree of resolution.
So give us an example, just to make sure that I'm following this. So, in the old world, you might have zip code. Is it a multi-family building, or is it a single-family building? And that was sort of the pool that you were in, the New York, large apartment building property pool. How do you think about categories? Like, what resolution are you at today, and what would that look like in 2 or 3 years?
So this really goes to the very core of Lemonade's IP, so I'm not going to talk about the exact elements. But anytime you interact with an app, you're generating mountains of data that are otherwise lost. So for example, when somebody goes through an app, do they bother reading the fine print or not? Do they play with defaults or do they not? What time of day are they doing this from? What kind of devices? How many times, what channel did they come through? You're just getting mountains and mountains of data which turn out to be highly predictive of risk. In that same conversation with the guy, after kind of making my comment, my distasteful comment, I said to him, he was asking me about our loss ratio, and I said to him that, it's still a bit early. Yes, we have hundreds of thousands of customers. This is some months ago now, but we don't yet have enough claims. Claims always lag, and you need enough claims in order to find all the correlates. And he smiled at me. He says, well, I can tell that you guys are different because no insurance company would ever say the words, we haven't had enough claims. So it really is that question of allowing the system to play out. And I like to think, I was never a fly on the wall at Walmart all those years ago, but I like to think that when Walmart first encountered Amazon back in the 90s, they realized that this was something different, and they took an interest, and they looked out the window and saw what was going on, and they said to each other, well, we'll see if this web thing catches on. We'll build a website as well. And I think we're kind of at that level with insurance companies. They're all looking at us. They're curious. They pay us the backhanded compliment of saying it's a neat app. And they think, well, if this thing works, we'll build an app as well. And what we've learned from Amazon 20 years later is that building a company on a digital substrate is not about a neat website. That facade is the kind of outermost expression of a profoundly different company, that every element, from HR to technology to processes to consumer interaction to every aspect, is radically different. And I think in insurance this will become even more the case, where at the moment it looks like, oh, they've got an app, we'll create an app. But the level of difference is so profound that what happens is that, as with Amazon, 20 years later, we're not seeing convergence. We're seeing continued divergence. Today they passed the $1 trillion mark in terms of market cap, and you just see that year after year after year, the differences become more pronounced rather than less. And with or without Lemonade, I think that the insurance sector is going to face that kind of Amazon moment over the course of the years to come.
We talked a little bit about IP, and you're sort of building up this sort of data model. This summer, you had a little bit of a legal kerfuffle with a German insurer, One Insurance, whose WeFox sort of product, you ended up having to do a cease and desist, but they were copying the app. They were doing a bunch of claims to try to figure out exactly how your model worked. How do you think about the IP side about it and protecting it, as well as staying open to the values of like a B Corp? How do you sort of balance those two sides?
So I wrote a blog post a few months ago about giving out awards for the #1 copycat of Lemonade. And actually, Liberty Mutual took the prize. They'd created a website at the time, which has since closed down, called Lulo, which
I figured it would be called apple juice or something.
Yeah, there you go, exactly. And we're torn between, on the one hand, I think any company that uses elements of what we're doing to be more customer-centric, to add charitable components to the business model, to deal with consumers fairly and in an expeditious way, to reduce the hassle of making claims because it tarnishes the reputation of our industry, all of that is fabulous. The only place where we draw a line is when people break the law. And I don't want to relate to the particular case that you asked me about, but our line passes very firmly where the laws get broken. And everything within the bounds of the law is fair game.
And let me ask you, talking about the law, you obviously work a lot with regulators. I mean, how do you build a relationship? So for those who don't know, in the insurance space, much of the regulations at the state level, not at the federal level. And so you're not just actually working with one regulator, you work with 50 state regulators all across the world, the country. How do you sort of engage them and sort of sell them on these sorts of new models? I mean, has it been harder in some states than others? Have everyone sort of understood, oh, this is great, we want everyone to sort of move this model? What's the divide there?
We do have a wonderful relationship with regulators, and I'm not just saying that because there's an audience. We do, but it is a challenge. I don't want to underplay it.
Yeah.
I think actually we are unusual in the insurance space, in the technology insurance space, for being a regulated insurance carrier. So we believe that to effect profound change, you can't just create a pretty website, a nice facade in front of a 100-year-old edifice. The amount of change that you can effect that way is very, very limited. And in our telling, the core problems of insurance, for reasons that we've already discussed, are at the business model level, and you have to change that. You have to neutralize conflicts of interest. You have to change the policy language. There's just so many things that have to be changed in the plumbing of the business rather than just that website that you put up in front. So we did want to create our own carrier, get our own licenses, and not be beholden to the incumbents. And for regulators, that was tough. I mean, the idea of having a novel business model where you give underwriting profits to nonprofits, it took them a while to get their head around that. But I think that if you come with clean hands, with experienced people, we had Dan Ariely on the behavioral economics, and we had the president of product from AIG and the chief underwriting officer of Liberty Mutual. We really built a whole team of people with deep expertise, each in their own domain. And you come well-funded, so Sequoia and Google and SoftBank, that carries some weight as well. And you bring that all together to regulators, and then they run water through the pipes. So they, for example, took all the data from Sandy, the disaster that hit back in 2012, and ran it through our model to make sure that we'd be able to withstand that. And ultimately, between that and having strong reinsurance partners and getting A-rated by rating agencies, all of that comes together. And then they monitor you, and now 2 years in, I think they feel really good that they gave us the license. But I will tell you this, it was touch and go.
Yeah.
It could have ended very differently. I think you flip that coin 10 times, maybe it comes up heads once.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I would, now knowing what I know, I'm not sure it was a very smart thing to do.
And how many states are you giving your product a day?
So today we cover about 60-something% of the US population, and that keeps growing.
Got it. And one of the new initiatives you just announced, I think last week, was this thing called Policy 2.0. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is a great example of why you want to be a carrier and why just creating a facade doesn't work. So we have a renter's insurance. We do homeowners, we do renters, we do condos, all different kind of product. We're licensed to sell any property and casualty insurance. So you take the renter's insurance policy. Now, I'm a newcomer to insurance. I've been in it for 3 years. And I'm a recovering attorney. I've been clean for 20 years, but I'm a recovering attorney, and my English is passable, and I could not understand our own insurance policy. Honestly, we started off with an industry standard policy. That's what you do, and that gives comfort to regulators and others that are using an industry standard policy. This thing was 20,000 words long, many of them from Middle English. I'm not talking Shakespeare, I'm talking Chaucer. And despite my training and everything else, honestly, I misread a lot of stuff then. I'm thinking, how can you build a trusting and trustworthy product when the core product is impenetrable to people who are even moderately trained, let alone your consumers? And how do you present that in an app, in a 5-inch screen with a few icons, when there are so many exceptions? The policy language in a standard policy has exceptions running 6 levels deep. exceptions to exceptions to exceptions to exceptions to exceptions, and I am not exaggerating. I counted them. And there's several hundred exceptions.
Okay.
And you just think, Jesus, how do you do this? So what we did was we went back to the drawing board. We wrote a policy from scratch. I actually spent several days on this myself. I thought, OK, I'm going to write this in English like a blog post. And we wrote it. We took out 90% of the words. We only use contemporary language. It reads seamlessly. It introduces some legal risk because you use normal terms rather than terms of art. And then there could be some litigation about what those means. But we think that if you are looking to help consumers and put it in plain English, ultimately that rewards you in the end of the day. And then we stuck it up on GitHub. So we took this policy, we did our best of making it work, and we said we're going to do two things. One is we're going to make it an open policy. So any of our competitors may use it. That's unheard of. We currently pay a vendor for using their policy. So we said this is open source, anybody can use it. And secondly, anybody can contribute. And people are going onto GitHub and adding comments and making suggestions and doing pull requests. And that's how we're writing the next generation of policy.
You guys could write the next generation of policy from your laptops right now. Let's go to talk a little bit about moral hazard. So yes. I think one of the challenges, you're simplifying these policies, obviously making a product that connects with more and more consumers. You have this issue of moral hazard, which is sort of a case where people's behavior changes as they buy the product. So they buy insurance, and then they therefore take larger risks. They set fires in their house and then demand for claims. How do you sort of handle that part of the business around moral hazard?
We don't see a lot of that. I think actually that what happens with insurance typically is that people are reticent to make claims because they perceive it as being a horrible process. And if it's a claim that you can afford to handle yourself, you say, to hell with it. I just don't want the headache of weeks of paperwork, fax machines, which I don't even have anymore, and all that kind of stuff. So we've radically simplified that. And now you make a claim with your app, you do it in seconds, and about a third of our claims get approved instantaneously by the bot, and the money's back in your account seconds after you press submit. Now that creates not what I regard as a moral hazard, but that creates an incentive to make more claims. And our answer to that is we're fine with that. When you buy insurance in order to get paid when a genuine event happens. What we're not fine with is fraudulent claims. But if you are a legitimate customer, you've paid us money, this is what you paid it for. And I always tell our team, we're in the business of paying claims. That's what we are here for. That's what our customers want of us. And once we neutralize our own moral hazard by saying we're not going to make money by denying claims, we don't get to keep that money, you set that aside, then you're all about delighting the customer. And you use technology to do that, you use behavioral economics, we have this give-back component, but it's really about, if it's a legitimate claim, pay it, and pay it as quickly as you can and delight customers. There's a site called ClearSurance that does reviews of websites. It's a consumer feedback site. We have nothing to do with them. They rank 270 of the insurance providers in the US. 2 years since our launch, we now rank #1 in the US in terms of customer satisfaction, and I think it's largely to do with that.
We have about a minute here left on stage. Give us a short kind of picture of the next couple of years for the company. You already raised a SoftBank round, so 2 years out of licensing. What's next for the company? How do you even spend $120 million?
Very quickly. Our ambitions are expansive. So when we look back over 2 years, we feel deeply grateful for how the stars have aligned, how we've been backed by such venerable companies, by the team that has joined us, by the customers that have put trust into us. So we feel like we've achieved in 2 years more than we'd set out, and we feel very, very grateful for that. But frankly, as measured against our ambitions, we've barely made a dent. We would like Lemonade to be one of the dominant insurance brands of the 21st century. And by that measure, when our competitors are 100 years old and $100 billion in business, we've got decades of work ahead of us. So it will be about expanding into new products. We're talking about, in the coming months, expanding globally. And in an industry that measures itself in trillions of dollars, really there's endless growth opportunities ahead of us, and that's what we'll be focused on.
Great. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us on stage.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.
Thank you.